I want to bring in NBC's Vaughn Hilliard in Miami with the president. We have NBC chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel. He's joining us live in Kharkiv, Ukraine. And Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, as well as an MSNBC international affairs analyst. Guys, it's good to have all you here. So you first, Vaughn. What's going on here?
3 years ago, we should note, when the war started and Russia began sending missiles into Ukraine and advancing military personnel onto the ground to take Ukrainian land, it was at that moment in time that we began hearing some on the fringe of the far right in the United States suggest that somehow the Russia's invasion was justified. And people like Tulsi Gabbard in recent years have echoed what other, even Republican lawmakers, have called Russian propaganda, that somehow Russia's invasion was justified because of Ukraine's interest in joining NATO. But what is so remarkable about the comments here down in Florida by President Trump yesterday was this: for the first time, again, nearly 3 years since the invasion, that we heard from Donald Trump expressly and explicitly say that it was Ukraine's fault for starting the war. And he followed that up this morning with that long social media post that was littered with falsehoods and statements that were inaccurate when it comes to amount of money that the U.S. has invested compared to the EU. But there is one particular attack on President Zelenskyy, in which he said, quote, "A dictator without elections, Zelenskyy better move fast or he is not going to have a country left." And now I think it's worth noting that it was 5 months ago when he was candidate Trump. It was actually at a campaign event in North Carolina that I was at, when he was talking about Zelenskyy, and he referred to him as the greatest salesman in the world. And a quote of his at the time, then candidate Trump, was, quote, "We continue to give billions of dollars to a man who refuses to make a deal. Zelenskyy." These are stunning comments from the President of the United States at a time in which EU leaders are questioning the commitment of this United States administration to continue to help Ukraine's war efforts against Russia. And all of this is happening at a time in which, we should note, just later on this evening, President Trump will be here in Miami to address a Saudi conference. All of this happening simultaneously. Alex?
Yeah. Hey, Vaughn, as you were speaking, I just want to note what you were addressing, this flagrant falsehood by Donald Trump. It's caught in the eye of, well, people around the globe. But frankly, let me read what former Vice President Mike Pence wrote. Again, we remind everyone, Donald Trump's former vice president in his first term. And he writes, "Mr. President, Ukraine did not start this war. Russia launched an unprovoked and brutal invasion, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The road to peace must be built on the truth." So, Vaughn, I know you've got stuff to get to. Thank you for joining us. Let me move to you, Ambassador, because I think there is a temptation to treat this all as some sort of foreign policy dispute. But it is bigger than that. Peter Baker described it as America giving the impression it's switching sides. Quote, "To listen to Mr. Trump talk with reporters on Tuesday about the conflict was to hear a version of reality that would be unrecognizable on the ground in Ukraine and certainly would never have been heard from any other American president of either party." What do you make of President Trump's comments, particularly these latest ones calling Zelenskyy a dictator?
It's shocking. It's appalling. As an American, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed for the soldiers that I just met in Munich, fighting for their freedom in Ukraine against the Russian invasion. They knew who started this war. And it's not in America's national interest to have the President of the United States of America talk in this way. This weakens us, not just in Europe, around the world. Everybody is looking at the president thinking he's flipping sides, just like you said. My next book coming out in the fall is called Autocrats versus Democrats. And now I have to question, which side will the United States be on by the time it comes out in the fall? And I just want to be crystal clear. We can have opinions on whatever. President Trump says falsehoods all the time. But when it damages America's reputation in the world, this is a really serious matter. And I hope the people, I know there is no way that Secretary Rubio agrees with that analysis. There is no way that National Security Advisor Waltz agrees with that analysis. There is no way that the majority of senators Republican senators and members of Congress agree with that analysis. Now is the time for them to speak up, because this could have catastrophic consequences for America's place in the world in the long term.
Listen, I'm going to take that a step further and say there's no way the majority of the world agrees with that analysis. So, Richard, what has been the reaction where you are?
So we were talking to Ukrainian troops out at frontline positions not long ago, and they were shocked. They didn't actually understand how President Trump could say that Ukraine started this war. They looked at me incredulously. They like I had misspoken. They said, well, "What do you mean?" He said, "We started the war." And they started to explain what they saw. They were here. I'm in the city of Kharkiv, which is in the east. They said, "What are you talking about? We're here in Kharkiv. We've been in these positions defending the city for the last 3 years. Russian troops were here invading, trying to take over the city." And they actually couldn't believe what they were being told. But we also talked further about this, not just these statements. They do recognize this as a pattern of statements coming from President Trump and a pattern of actions, that these negotiations are happening. The impression here is that President Trump favors the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and they're very worried that this country is being carved up with little regard to the wishes and political aspirations of the people of this country. And Alex, I'll tell you one other thing. I've covered troops in combat for a couple of decades now, and one of the most sensitive things that they never talk about is morale. When I was with U.S. troops in Iraq or in other parts of the world, they would gripe and they would tell you their grievances and their issues, but they always talked about how the morale was high. And today I spoke to these Ukrainian troops and I asked them how they're feeling watching this Trump initiative that's starting with Russia, listening to these latest Trump comments. And they said to me, it actually is lowering morale, that it is having an impact on the way the soldiers conduct themselves, carry themselves, their desire to show up for duty in the battlefield. And that is a real impact when you have the president's comments lowering morale of a fighting force that is supposed to be your ally. That is a major issue, and certainly a major change. I think you described it earlier as a 180-degree change. There's no other way to describe it. A few months ago, the U.S. was considered the essential ally here, and now many Ukrainians, including the troops, are wondering if they do have an ally left in Washington.
Indeed, and President Zelenskyy, as you well know, Richard, has said if the United States pulls out their support, Ukraine's not going to be able to go alone. It won't be able to do it. All right, Richard, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I know you have more reporting to get to. So back to you, Ambassador. With the president's position being embraced by the Kremlin, we have Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov praising Trump as, quote, the first, and so far, in my opinion, the only Western leader who has publicly and loudly said that one of the root causes of the Ukrainian situation was the impudent line of the previous administration to draw Ukraine into NATO. This is already a signal that he understands our position. So the message at the Kremlin, what's being received through all of this?
Well, this is beyond their wildest dreams. I mean, I think they assumed that there was going to be some pressure for negotiations with the election of President Trump. I know the Ukrainians assumed that too. And they were all ready for it, both sides. What I think they did not assume is that the Trump administration would, even before negotiations have started, would signal to the Kremlin that they're willing to give them everything that they wanted at the very beginning of the war. Remember what Putin said. He said, we're invading to liberate these territories. The Trump administration has said Ukraine has to give them territories. He said, we want neutrality. We don't want Ukraine in NATO. The Trump administration has already said that. The Trump administration has talked about lifting sanctions. And to add insult to injury, they're now saying that Zelenskyy, President Zelenskyy, the democratically elected president of Ukraine, who is abiding by the Ukrainian constitution, including the clause about martial law, now has to stand for re-election before they will start the negotiations. And none of those demands are being made of Putin, who's been in power as a dictator for 25 years. I honestly think they never imagined that they would be in such a great position early on. Now, I hope that the Trump team will get their act together. I hope that they'll think about the consequences of just capitulating right and left. But I worry they've gotten off to a terrible start and we're already in a hole.